My name is Eva Karene Bartlett. I'm a Canadian-American journalist. I've done a lot of reporting from Palestine, from Syria, also the Donbass, and some from Venezuela. My focus is, for the most part, both to give voice to the populations that are in the countries being targeted by Western policies or wars or occupation, and also, quite often, it turns out, to challenge the Western propaganda, which usually emanates from Washington by journalists who've never been in the country in question, or if they do go, they knowingly and intentionally distort the reality of what they've seen or heard. So I'm always the first to note that I wasn't always political, and I actually came from a very politically naive background. And when I did come across the issue of Palestine, I was astonished that I'd never heard about the occupation, the expulsion of the indigenous people from Palestine to create the state that is known as Israel. I never heard any of that when I was growing up. I wasn't taught any of that in school. And when I came across it as an adult, I was astonished that I didn't know anything about it. And also, because I was quite naive, astonished that it was going on in the 21st century. And after reading and listening quite a bit to things pertaining to Palestine, this is the early 2000s, I decided I had to go and see for myself. It took another 6 or so years before I finally went to occupied Palestine. In 2007, I went to the West Bank, and I spent 8 months there in areas that are heavily and hardly affected by the Israeli occupation forces, by the illegal Jewish colonists who run amok and are free to do as awful and horrible and violent things as they want to against Palestinian civilians, including children. And so I was all over the occupied West Bank, in villages and cities that were coming under Israeli invasions, Israeli army invasions. I also participated in the nonviolent protests because, you know, often people in the West say, why can't Palestinians be nonviolent? Well, they have been for decades. They've created various ways of nonviolently protesting the theft of their land and the brutal oppression they live under daily. So I went to these protests, particularly in the village of Bilain, and I saw how they would march on their own land to protest the Israeli theft of their land for the apartheid wall Israel built in the 2000s. And they were met with incredible violence by the Israeli army, rubber-coated lead bullets, tear gas canisters shot at the body, and even live ammunition. And so I saw this, and I saw this in other areas of the West Bank, and I saw the brutality of the illegal Jewish colonists against Palestinians, and even the more simple things of the dehumanizing military checkpoints that are throughout the occupied West Bank, which make it impossible for a Palestinian to go from their home to their place of work, to their place of worship, to the market, to the family, to the relatives, to hospital, without going through these checkpoints, if they can even get through them. And after 8 months of seeing this incredible injustice, I was a very changed person, because it affects you. I think it's very difficult to see this and not be moved, and just go back to your very comfortable, in comparison, life. And so from that point on, I was eventually deported from Palestine by the Israeli government. And then I went to Gaza the next year by boat from Cyprus and landed myself there literally before Israel waged its 2008-2009 3-week war on Gaza. And so that was a deep immersion into the savagery, which is the Israeli policies against Palestinians, whether it's full-on war, slow starvation, as in their policies in Gaza, preventing farmers from working, preventing fishers from fishing by violently attacking them with cannons, with heavy machine gun fire, with sniper fire, by stealing their fishing boats, by abducting fishers, abducting farmers. In addition to which, the wars they wage every so often, and now we are over 1 year into Israel's full-on genocide, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians of Gaza. So this is what, it was a slow awakening, and then when you're on the ground in Palestine, it becomes very real, very quickly, and impossible to turn away from. So, as with most conflicts that have been started or prolonged by the West, the Western corporate media toes the line and carries the narratives that back the Western agenda, whether it's in Syria, in Ukraine, or in Palestine. So, for example, post-October 7th, Western media would have an audience that maybe isn't so well informed believe that everything was relatively fine in Palestine and Israel, and that October 7th was the biggest crime. This is not my words, this is basically what they're trying to purvey. The biggest crime against innocent Israel, negating the fact that it's an occupation, it's an apartheid state, and the decades of violence against Palestinians, you know, not only brutality that results in being maimed or killed, but the decades of abducting Palestinian civilians and holding them as hostages for months and months, or even for years, in administrative detention, and torturing them in prison, in administrative detention, these Palestinian hostages. The Western corporate media don't want people to know that, because that doesn't fit the narrative. The narrative must be that Israel is, quote unquote, the victim, and now that Israel has to, quote unquote, retaliate against Palestinians. Now, what they are omitting is that under international law, Palestinians have the right to resist their occupiers by any means possible. Now, let's compare our situation, for example, Syria. Western narratives on Syria were that from 2011, the Syrian population uprose against a quote-unquote evil dictator, not my words, and that they wanted to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad. That was the narrative pushed by Western media, not only for the first months, but for years and years, even till today. So literal al-Qaeda terrorists and other terrorists under different names, whether it was the Free Syrian Army at the beginning, or Jaish al-Hur, that's Free Syrian Army, I'm sorry, or Ahrar al-Sham, all these different names, they all committed the same terrorist acts against Syrian civilians from the very beginning and throughout the now over 10 years, 12 years of war on Syrian civilians. But the Western media narrative was, this is a peaceful revolution, and they were forced to take up arms. So let's look at that point. Let's assume it was peaceful. It was not. It was violent from the very beginning. They were armed from the very beginning. But let's assume the Western narrative is true, and they protested nonviolently for a year or 2 years, and then finally they had to take up arms against their oppressor. Well, hello, that's Palestinians for decades, peacefully protesting, general strikes. And yes, they took up arms, and they have every right to do so. So the Western narrative, by portraying Israel consistently, especially since October 7th, as a victim, and whitewashing the crimes that the State of Israel was founded upon, is, firstly, they know they're lying. They're doing the bidding of the West. It's dishonest journalism, and it's the kind of journalism we will see in any, not only conflict, but, for example, even when you extend it to Latin America, to Venezuela, the way the reality on the ground is manipulated to serve the agenda, where their agenda is, again, to overthrow the Venezuelan government and install something that is more favorable to Western interest, as it was in Syria. So back to the question of Palestine on October 7th, not only did the Western corporate media delete the 7 decades prior to October 7th, 2023, but then, since October 7th and Israel's brutality, its genocide and ethnic cleansing of Gaza, Western corporate media has just completely removed who is doing the brutality in Gaza. Palestinians are just mysteriously dying. They're being bombed. By whom? They don't say. They're starving. Why? They don't say. They don't mention that from the very beginning, the Israeli leadership said, we are going to starve them. And they described them in Palestinians as human animals. They described them in despicable terms, and not for the first time. This is something Israeli leadership have not been shy to do for a very long time, to dehumanize Palestinians and also to boast about how they're going to torture and kill them. So that's what they did from October 7th on, and yet Western media will put out, New York Times, all the corporate papers will put out headlines like Palestinians starving, et cetera, removing the culpability of the State of Israel on these crimes. And so if you took the same issue, for example, let's look back at Syria once again. In Syria, there was varying levels of war propaganda depending on the area in question. In 2016, Aleppo was the city in question because the Syrian army and its allies were working to liberate Aleppo of al-Qaeda and co-terrorists that were bombing residential civilian areas of Syria or sniping civilians, killing, by the way, up to 11,000 civilians alone. This doesn't include the Syrian Arab Army, just civilians in Aleppo. And so the Syrian government and its allies, including Russia, including regional allies, were working to liberate that city of al-Qaeda so people could walk freely in the streets again and not be killed by random mortars or gas canister bombs or whatever. And throughout 2016, Western corporate media was pushing narratives to incriminate the Syrian government. The Syrian government is starving civilians in eastern Ghouta, or eastern Aleppo, sorry. Well, the Ghouta came later. Was one of the more prominent ones, or the Syrian government has killed all the doctors in Aleppo, which wasn't true at all. There was over 4,000 doctors and 800 specialists working in Aleppo. But the issue of starvation, there was no question of who they were accusing. It wasn't true, but they were accusing the Syrian government, and they stated it very clearly, very loudly in their headlines. There was no question of who was doing the starving. In reality, actually, it wasn't true, though, because the government did allow food and aid into Aleppo or eastern Ghouta or Al-Wa'ar or Madaya, but the terrorist factions within had control of everything that came in, and they were the reason people were starving. I know because I went to all the places I just listed, and Syrian civilians told me. So back to the question of media, they've, as I've said, they've made Israel the permanent victim, no matter the fact that if Russia was to do in Ukraine right now, or if Syria had actually done all the things that Israel is doing, Western media would be screaming 24/7, and they would be demanding no-fly zones and the overthrow of whichever power was in power. But when Israel is doing it, the UN issues mild statements of concern. People say, well, it could eventually amount to genocide, and we're 1 year into this, but nothing is done to actually stop Israel, which, if we need to lay it out, bombing schools, UN schools, sheltering displaced Palestinians who fled the areas where they lived because Israel told them to evacuate to safe zones, and then bombing those safe zones, using chemical weapons like white phosphorus on civilians, which I have seen the effects of white phosphorus and what it did to civilians in 2009 in Gaza, and it is incredibly nasty. Shooting at civilians who have been starved by Israel, who had prevented food from entering Gaza, shooting at them when they lined up for simple flour to bake bread, and just gunning them down, and then lying about it later saying, oh, well, there was a stampede, this was crowd control. The Israeli atrocities are endless, and the Western media whitewashing them is equally endless. I wanted to share with people here at the Tolfa International Forum today my experiences from the Donbass, because there are other Western reporters, and of course notably Russian journalists, that have been honestly and courageously covering reality on the ground. But I have my perspective because I've spent considerable time there in 2022, also 2019, and then last year and this year. But so I spoke about what I had seen of Ukraine's war crimes against civilians, noting some of the more obvious examples of Ukraine shelling busy central Donetsk, another city, but I'm speaking of Donetsk streets, at prime times where civilians were walking, of course, without any sort of body armor, and slaughtering. I've seen dozens of Donbass civilians, Donetsk civilians slaughtered by these bombings. And by the way, I have to draw a parallel here. This is exactly what the terrorists in Syria did. They took the prime times when children were going to or from school, when people were going to marketplace, when the streets were full, and that's when they shelled Damascus, all around Damascus and its countryside with mortars, trying to ensure maximum death and maiming. So I spoke about that. I spoke about Ukraine's use of the petal mines, which is against all international law, and which Ukraine itself had pledged to destroy its own 6 million stock of these dangerous little petal mines that, while they're small, they blow off feet and hands, depending on what comes into contact with them. They've actually killed, of the 167 Donbass civilians they've maimed, they've killed 3. So I spoke about that. But also something more nefarious, and that is, I began by mentioning some of the media tropes that Western and Ukrainian media have used to accuse Russia of war crimes. And I also gave the caveat, I'm reporting from the Donbass. I can't go to Ukrainian areas. I can't corroborate or discredit those claims from Ukraine because Ukraine won't let me. They've put me on a kill list. So I'm speaking to what I've seen in the Donbass and elsewhere in Russia. And so I talked about one of the tropes being Ukraine accusing Russia of digging mass graves outside of Mariupol. And I very easily debunked those claims by going to the sites in question, which, as it turned out, were normal functioning cemeteries. But I also spoke about this trope Ukraine has and the West have accused Russia of, and that is kidnapping children. And so it is well known by now that Russia has enabled civilians to leave conflict areas and go to areas of shelter. So, for example, from Bakhmut or Artyomovsk, from Kherson, from other areas, from Avdiivka, and taken them either to areas in the Donbass or elsewhere in Russia. And so, and they've done this to prevent children from being slaughtered. The children are taken with their families. If the families don't want to move, they can stay. Because I've interviewed people who said, I came because I wanted to. I was afraid for my children. My family stayed. My mom and dad stayed. They didn't want to leave. And so after one of my trips to the Donbass in, I believe it was November 2022, I continued south to a coastal city called Anapa, in a coastal Russian city. And there I met, there's a very lovely setup. It's a resort city. And I don't remember the number of refugees that were staying there, but it was well over 1,000, if not more, being put up in very nice apartments. So not what you would imagine like a refugee camp. And I spoke with a number of people, but what stood out to me was this one woman, and she had 3 young children who were there. I saw them. They were sitting next to her and running around playing. And she told me, I asked her about the conditions. We spoke for a while, and then I said, you know, what do you think about this? Western media says, and Ukraine says, Russia is kidnapping your children. And she said, well, no, they're here with me. And then she said, but actually her in-laws kept calling her, demanding to speak with the children because they believed Ukrainian media, which were saying that. And she said the first few times the in-laws called, her kids were actually playing or swimming or at the cinema or something like that. And the in-laws kept thinking she was lying. And then finally they called and she was able to put them on the phone and let them see the kids. And so that's how strong the propaganda was to her husband's parents still in Ukraine. But what's interesting too, last year when I went back to Donetsk, I went with a colleague of mine to interview people that had been evacuated from Artyomovsk or Bakhmut. And so they spoke of Ukraine shelling their apartment buildings. They were sheltering in the basements. But the more insidious nature of what they had to say was that there's a group of Ukrainian military police that generally are dressed in white, and they have the nickname the White Angels. And they were coming there looking for children. And it was under the premise of we're going to evacuate the children to safety. These people, the parents did not want their children going anywhere without them. And so they were hiding their kids from every time. They said sometimes they would come in the morning and in the evening. They were that keen to take the children away from them. And so they were very worried about this, but they were able to, I mean, they did see some children being taken away, which gave them all the more concern to protect their children. And what's interesting is that other areas like Avdiivka, I'd have to look at my notes here, Slavyansk, Chasiv Yar, other areas also had the similar stories of residents that were sheltering and hiding from these Ukrainian military police, also saying the same thing happened. They were coming for their children. So, you know, it's really, like I was saying today at the conference, it's a case of Ukraine accusing Russia of doing what it itself is doing, just like Israel accuses Palestinians of doing what it itself is doing. So, for example, Israel accused Hamas October 7th of beheading babies, 40 babies, they said, and they accused Hamas of raping detainees or hostages, as they say. And in fact, it wasn't Hamas doing any of those atrocities. And as we've seen horrifically, the Israeli bombings throughout Gaza have actually decapitated children and adults. And the Israelis have been raping Palestinian hostages. And in fact, it's such an issue in Israel, they were protesting for the right to rape Palestinian hostages. So, I mean, it's that sadistic. But as I said, this pointing the finger and saying you're doing something, and it is in fact their confession of that's what they do, but they're going to project that on you.
Yeah.
So, you know, in 2019, when I first went to the Donbass, I went to the city of Gorlivka, which, if people aren't aware, Gorlivka came under intense Ukrainian shelling in mid-2014, killing around 30 civilians in one day alone. That day has become known as Bloody Sunday in Gorlivka because they were shelling the very center of the city, and people weren't prepared for that. This is 2014. You know, this is after the Maidan coup. People in the Donbass didn't initially say we want to be breakaway republics, as Western media said. They said we don't want what's happening in Kiev and Odessa to come to us. And being ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking, they had every right to fear that. But when I was in Gorlivka, then I went to villages around Gorlivka, closer to the front lines, that were being hammered day and particularly night by Ukrainian shelling. And before going to these villages, I met some of the defenders of the people that were in the local militias, if you want to call them, and I spoke with them. And it's actually, here's a parallel. If you recall the propaganda around the white helmets in Syria, there was a lot of, these are bakers, these are teachers, and, you know, as I say a lot, they've literally taken the narrative of other people, Palestinians and also the people in Donbass, and attributed them to white helmets, which were purely a propaganda construct. And I mention that because the people I met were literally, Donbass is a mining area, so most of them were miners. Some of them were bakers, some of them were truck drivers. But they took up arms, and they didn't have proper arms. They took up whatever they could to fight for their lives and their people in the early years, 2014 and 15, until there were a lot of defections from the Ukrainian army, because they were also in the Ukrainian army. There are ethnic Russian speakers, and their sympathies lay with the Donbass, and they don't want to slaughter their own people. So many of them defected to the Donbass and joined these militias, and eventually becoming the force that they are now. But I make that point because in 2019, when I went to these different villages that were being fired upon, I would ask them, you know, who was shelling you? And they'd say, well, Ukraine is. And the reason I ask that is because Western media will often say it's Russia shelling them. And so I say, how did you know it's Ukraine? And they would say, because they've been shelling us since 2014. We know the direction it's coming from. And also then fast forward to 2022 and 3, when I would go to, for example, northern Donetsk, which was a very hard-hit district, being shelled all the time. Even now, it's still being shelled heavily. Or western Donetsk, also very hard-hit. And talk with people, they'd say, they're shelling us every day. And you literally look around and you see windows blown out, rooftops blown out, and you know they're not exaggerating. And you hear the shelling when you're there. And in one of my trips, I think late 2022, I went with a couple other journalists to Gorlivka and then to, again, villages being heavily shelled by Ukrainian forces. And there I met people who had fled still other villages to what they thought would be the safety of this one village, Golmovsky. And it was being, again, shelled so often that people didn't want to stop and talk. They didn't want to risk being out in public. But those I did speak with said, I would ask them, why are they shelling you? And they said, they don't see us as human. They don't consider us worthy of living. And that's something I've heard over and over again. People there are very intelligent and cultured and educated, like Palestinians are, like Syrians are. But the media has dehumanized them to justify Ukraine or Israel or the Syrian terrorists killing of these civilians as it doesn't really matter because, you know, they're not really that important, they're not really human. And you have Ukrainian leadership, just as Israeli leadership, saying, you're going to suffer, you're going to have to stay in basements because your lives aren't, your children are going to be in basements. Poroshenko, I think, was saying that back years and years ago, and it's true. People got used to running to shelters or to basements if they had them. And in fact, in Donbass, if you have these big apartment blocks, they leave the entrances open because they're so used to the shelling that if they leave the entrances shut, that's a death sentence to people who are outside. So this concept of such hatred towards the population of the Donbass, then I would ask people I met there, hey, do you have friends in Ukraine? And they say, of course we do. I'd ask, do you hate Ukrainians? They say, no, we don't. I mean, I'm talking in general, my experiences. There, I'm sure, are isolated cases, or maybe not even isolated. I'm sure there are people who do hate Ukrainians, but the people I spoke with, they said, no, they were our brothers and sisters. We went to school there. We did sporting events there. We traveled as tourists there. And even some commanders that I met at a front line about 70 meters from then occupied Avdiivka. And so they're in a very stressful position because it's very dangerous there. And we talked about a variety of things, and I posed that question to them too. And they said the same thing. No, we don't hate them. I say, what would you say to them? And they said, go home. This is our land. We will defend it, but we don't want you to die. And when they'd say who they do hate, they'd say, of course, we hate the Kiev regime. We hate the Nazis. We hate those that are bombing us. But civilians we don't hate because they're literally their brothers and sisters. They were family. So, I mean, that's important because, and also, I live in the Moscow countryside. And my neighbors would send humanitarian aid whenever I'd go down there. But they'd also express concern for Ukrainians. And they say, they're not that political, but they understand that this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. And they don't want, and it's not just these neighbors, it's many people I have conversations with in where I live. They don't want the war to go on. They support their army and their president. They understand why it is, but they don't want killing to occur. And that's a different mentality than what we see from these hardline Ukrainian nationalists or what we see from Israelis towards Palestinians.
Yes.
So earlier I spoke of the issue of mass graves and whether there were or weren't. And in going in April and then I believe it was September or November, I went to the other two areas in question, which the Ukrainian authorities and Western media were alleging were massive graves, like 30 meters wide pits into which bodies were being chucked and then buried. And it wasn't the case. What I saw were, as I said before, existing graveyards, existing cemeteries. One in particular was called Stary Krim, and it was a vast cemetery, very old and vast cemetery, which continued to function as a cemetery. There was a burial in process when I went there. There was a funeral in process at a small chapel. And I saw an elderly pair of grandparents visiting their granddaughter's gravesite. And there were some local journalists there. And so I was speaking with them, and they say, you should know. Oh, by the way, there was a man, an elderly man being buried. And if this was November 2022, this is long after the fighting in Mariupol. That ended in April, right? So this didn't have to do, it was a natural death or whatever his cause of death was. But these journalists said, you should keep in mind that during the fighting, people had nowhere to bury their loved ones. So they were burying them in the courtyards, in the grass outside their apartment buildings. And so later, when there was calm, they transferred the bodies of their loved ones to proper cemeteries, which is obviously, as Orthodox Christians, very important to them. I visited another area in the Lugansk People's Republic in, I think, May or June 2022. That area was Rubizhny. And I was there with some other journalists, and we went to a school that was housing displaced people, and they had been living in apartments about 1 kilometer away, where the fighting was ongoing between the Ukrainian forces and the Russians. And it was the same situation as in Mariupol. Ukrainian forces had occupied their apartment buildings and forced them into the ground floors, and in some cases locked them in the ground floors, and held them as human shields. And so when we went to visit them at the schools, you could see plots where people had recently been buried, because there was a representative of the Lugansk People's Republic, Anna Soraka, who has done a lot to help her people. And she was saying, now I might get the statistics wrong, but when we were there, she was saying just days before there were, I believe it was 60 or 100 bodies in the streets. And so the shelling was ongoing, but bear in mind, this was 1 kilometer away, but the shelling was still occurring at the school as well. So people were hastily burying their loved ones as they could. And I don't think many can really appreciate the importance of that, because in the West, where we have more privileged lives, if we lose a loved one to whatever cause of death, we do have that luxury of a final goodbye and a proper burial and ceremony. So I think there's so many aspects to war that are very tragic, in addition to the obvious ones, the loss of life and the graphic nature of that. But also, even if you think about the Donbass and the fact that, as Western media would omit, since 2014, they've been warred upon. There's a psychological stress of having to endure life. And frankly, you get used to the shelling. You get to the point where you're like, yeah, it's probably going to be okay. And you go in the street knowing you're going to possibly be shelled, but you're like, well, I either work, I either go to the store and get what's necessary, or I cower at home. I choose the former, you know. But then that means a kind of indifference to the shelling. And that's a psychological stress that is not normal. It's not normal to be indifferent to potentially being killed. But when you're in that position every day for 8 years, then it becomes normal.